The betrayal wasn't a sudden, blinding flash of rage. It was a slow, deliberate suffocation administered by someone who knew exactly where the windpipe was. My cousin Veronica had always approached our relationship like a low-stakes game of chess, but I hadn't realized until this week that she was playing to capture the king. For 2 years, I had quietly managed the preliminary work on the Catalyst acquisition, a multi-million-dollar Miami portfolio that represented my final hurdle before becoming a full partner in my Uncle Richard's firm, the firm that was effectively our family legacy. It wasn't just a promotion. It was my ticket to self-sufficiency, a shield against the low-level contempt I'd always felt from Veronica and her mother. I had done the work, stayed late, and delivered every projection early. The final vote was scheduled for Friday. The trap sprung on Tuesday afternoon. I was called into a terse, unscheduled meeting with 2 senior partners and my Uncle Richard, all of them arranged around the mahogany conference table like a silent, hostile firing squad. The air in the room was dense, not with conflict, but with something far colder finality. Uncle Richard avoided my gaze as a partner named David slid a printed stack of emails across the table, a collection of fabricated correspondence that alleged I had been diverting company time and proprietary due diligence data to a personal, unsanctioned real estate venture. I knew instantly it was a lie, but the paperwork was meticulous. The timestamps, the slightly altered email addresses, the sophisticated jargon, it was all designed to look like the work of an intelligent insider who had grown greedy. "We have to suspend you pending an investigation, Carmen," David said, his voice flat with professional disappointment. "The optics are simply too damaging right now, right before the vote." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue or protest the obvious absurdity of the charges. I simply absorbed the moment, letting the injustice settle like a heavy weight in my stomach, converting the emotional pain into pure, clean data. My training as a management consultant had taught me that a sudden emotional outburst only validates the attacker's narrative. Instead, I focused on the source of the fabrication, not the symptom. I knew the only person with the motive, the access, and the intricate knowledge of my workflow was Veronica. She was due to inherit my portfolio the moment I was dismissed, and she would then secure her own partnership track. It was perfectly cruel and perfectly executed. "I understand," I replied, my voice steady, perhaps too steady. "I will cooperate fully. Just tell me who the initial source of the report was." Uncle Richard finally looked up, his expression a mix of regret and dismissal. "It was an anonymous tip, Carmen. We can't disclose more." A convenient lie, one that insulated Veronica perfectly. I stood, gathered my briefcase, and walked out without another word, leaving the manufactured evidence lying on the table like discarded trash. I drove home not in a panic, but with a strategic calm. Veronica had played her best hand, believing I was beaten. What she didn't know was that her move had merely triggered my counter-strategy. The chess game wasn't over. She had simply confirmed where I needed to move the pieces. I reached for my phone, my fingers cold and precise on the screen, opening the encrypted message thread to the one resource I knew could trace digital fingerprints better than any internal IT team. The clock had started, and she was about to find out that my composure wasn't surrender. It was the quiet confidence of someone who already held the winning evidence. I drove home not in a panic, but with a strategic calm. Veronica had played her best hand, believing I was beaten. What she didn't know was that her move had merely triggered my counter-strategy. The chess game wasn't over. She was about to find out that my composure wasn't surrender. It was the quiet confidence of someone who already held the winning evidence. The initial shock of the meeting had lasted precisely as long as the drive out of the parking garage, a short, sharp jolt that served only to sharpen my focus. I canceled my afternoon appointments, letting my assistant relay my fabricated sudden illness, and walked into my apartment not to grieve the betrayal, but to catalog the assets. My primary asset wasn't the raw data on the servers. It was the fact that I knew Veronica's playbook better than she did because I had studied her ambition for years. Her weakness, the soft underbelly I'd been tracking, was her absolute need for public validation. She craved the congratulatory handshake and the envious glance from people like our Aunt Clara. She wouldn't just want the deal, she would want to parade her supposed superiority over me. This meant she wouldn't be subtle about taking over the Miami file. She would leverage my suspension to look like the responsible, steady hand stepping in during a crisis. The evidence I possessed was a time-stamped mirror of every email thread, every internal memo, and every whispered strategy session related to the Catalyst deal secured via a ghost protocol I'd implemented 6 months prior, right after my first much smaller professional dispute with Veronica. I had coded a script that mirrored all designated communications to an external, offshore, highly encrypted drive accessible only by a 2-factor key phrase that was ironically a line from a book Veronica publicly claimed to despise. It was a quiet insurance policy against the kind of casual corporate sabotage I knew she was capable of. But the emails weren't enough to guarantee reinstatement. They only proved I hadn't been trading secrets for profit. I needed the motive, the explicit confirmation of malicious intent. That confirmation came from a completely different channel. A mutual acquaintance, an ambitious junior broker named Marcus, who had recently lost a small side deal to Veronica, had reached out a week before the suspension seeking advice on dealing with a hyper-competitive colleague. I had advised caution, but Marcus had been desperate. He had managed to record a brief, candid video call where Veronica celebrating an early victory on the Miami groundwork, a victory she shouldn't have had yet, had been bragging to a confidant. In that low-resolution clip, she explicitly detailed her plan to make Carmen look like a compromised asset, using carefully timed leaks specifically mentioning the creation of the fake data logs that I now held in my hand. She hadn't just wanted the deal, she wanted the spectacle of my fall. I sat at my kitchen island, the laptop screen displaying the corrupted file structure the firm was now using to investigate me, juxtaposed against the clear, incriminating footage of Veronica's unguarded arrogance. The contrast was jarring. They saw incompetence and fraud. I saw premeditation and a digital footprint she thought only she controlled. This was no longer about getting my job back. It was about ensuring that when the dust settled, the firm understood that the perceived crisis wasn't a failure of judgment on my part, but a successful act of corporate espionage against me. I didn't reach out to Marcus immediately. I didn't call Uncle Richard. I simply ensured the primary drive holding the hard evidence was backed up to a third geographically separate location. The objective now shifted. I needed the perfect stage. The consequences had to be public, undeniable, and delivered at the precise moment of Veronica's assumed triumph. The time for quiet calculation was over. The time for the controlled revelation was imminent. The following morning, I maintained the facade of a woman grappling with a career-ending scandal. I answered curtly to my lawyer a contingency I'd established years ago for exactly this kind of corporate ambush, confirming that I had no defense to offer because the allegations were manufactured, but that I was respecting the firm's process by remaining silent until they formally charged me. This quiet compliance bought me the most valuable commodity time and distance. Veronica, secure in the knowledge that I was on the defensive, would be busy solidifying her victory, which meant overcompensating in her interactions with the partners and, crucially, with Uncle Richard. My first strategic move was psychological, aimed squarely at Marcus, the junior broker, whose recorded conversation was my silver bullet. I reached out not with panic, but with an offer of professional mentorship, praising his keen insight into office dynamics when we last spoke. I framed my suspension not as a defeat, but as a necessary, albeit temporary, removal from the noise, so I could focus on future larger opportunities Marcus could be part of. I needed him to trust that I was ascending again, even while suspended. I made it clear that his cooperation, should it ever be necessary, would be rewarded with a guaranteed recommendation for a better position, one that Veronica, now laser-focused on the Miami deal, would never notice him vying for. His insecurity, the exact opposite of Veronica's arrogant assurance, made him pliable. He agreed cautiously to simply keep his ears open and share anything unusual about the internal meetings regarding the Catalyst acquisition handover. Meanwhile, I started my deep dive into the physical evidence of the fabricated emails. I didn't need to hack the firm's server, that would be criminal, and only validate their suspicions. Instead, I focused on the metadata of the files they had presented to me. I remembered a detail from Veronica's boastful video she mentioned, using a specific older version of an internal PDF creation software that the firm had phased out 2 years ago, a detail she clearly remembered from her time in a lower support role. This was a crucial tiny thread. I cross-referenced the file properties of the submitted evidence against the standard digital signature the firm now used. Sure enough, the provided exhibits carried the obsolete digital watermark. It proved the documents were created using non-standard older software that was not logged on any current employee's workstation. It was a technical signature of an amateur trying to look professional, a flaw only visible when one possessed both the evidence and the intimate knowledge of the perpetrator's habits. The setting for the final confrontation needed to be unavoidable, inescapable, and publicly significant. The quarterly partnership review gala was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, a mandatory black tie event where major deals were informally announced and accolades were distributed. It was where Veronica would expect her victory lap to begin. I needed to be officially cleared by then, or at the very least possess leverage so powerful that Uncle Richard would be forced to allow me to address the room. The next few days were spent in meticulous preparation, legally solidifying Marcus's statement, ensuring the time-stamped recordings were compressed into a single high-definition presentation file, and most importantly, choosing the right projector. The moment of humiliation had to be delivered with maximum visual impact on a screen large enough to dwarf her entire existence. The choice of projector was not incidental. It was foundational to the strategy. I didn't want a flickering image on a portable screen. I needed the kind of clarity and scale that demanded attention, the type of high lumens machine used for major corporate presentations. I arranged for a specialized AV rental company, not the firm's usual vendor, to deliver, and set up a projector and a retractable cinema-quality screen in the grand ballroom of the Intercontinental, the very venue hosting the gala. The official reason I provided was that I was preemptively preparing a supplementary presentation in case the investigation was concluded favorably before the event, allowing me to speak. This was a lie, but a plausible one that relied on the firm's desire for continuity. I secured the setup under my personal security code, ensuring that only I could access or operate the equipment. With the stage set, my attention returned to the legal maneuvering necessary to bypass my suspension. My attorney, Mr. Chen, an aggressively quiet man who specialized in white-collar defense, advised against directly presenting the evidence to Uncle Richard. Doing so would turn my strategic move into an internal mediation which would allow the firm to contain the damage and protect their image. And by extension, protect Veronica, a potential future partner. We needed a public crisis that only I could resolve. Mr. Chen, following my instructions, sent a meticulously worded letter to the firm's legal counsel. The letter did not address the charges of misappropriation. Instead, it focused on the procedural flaw the firm had failed to provide me with the legally required detailed evidence log within the mandated 48 hours of suspension. It was a technicality, but in the world of high-stakes finance, procedure is paramount. The letter stated that if I was not formally reinstated or provided a satisfactory verified explanation for the delay by 6:00 p.m. the evening before the gala, I would be forced to seek an injunction and file a lawsuit for defamation and breach of contract, naming the anonymous leaker as an accessory and demanding a full forensic audit of all internal communications related to my suspension. This threat was calculated. A lawsuit would force the firm to disclose proprietary information and expose the internal mess, the exact public exposure Uncle Richard feared. I wasn't going to sue. The evidence I had was far more potent than any court proceeding, but the threat itself was a sophisticated lever. It signaled to the partners that I wasn't just a suspended consultant. I was a proactive legal threat with significant leverage. It forced Uncle Richard to choose between his image and protecting Veronica. I had anticipated that given the impending gala, he would choose damage control. As the clock ticked down to the deadline, I received the call from Uncle Richard's personal line. He didn't apologize. He simply offered a neutral settlement. The firm would officially withdraw the suspension, citing insufficient evidence for the initial claim, and allow me to attend the gala as a consultant, but I would not be reinstated to the Catalyst acquisition file for another 6 months. A consolation prize that still allowed Veronica to take the victory lap she craved. I accepted immediately. The 6-month delay was irrelevant. All I needed was to have my access card reactivated and my name off the list of sanctioned personnel. I was officially back inside the fortress, no longer an outsider shouting through the gates. Veronica, I knew, would see this as a weak compromise proof that I was only half vindicated, and she would carry her arrogance into the ballroom believing she had won the decisive battle. She had no idea that I had just signed the contract on her defeat. The night of the quarterly partnership gala arrived an evening saturated with the false intimacy of forced networking and the polished veneer of success I knew was about to shatter for one person. My access badge was reactivated just hours before the event, a silent admission of error by the firm, one they hoped to smother with champagne and muted conversation. I arrived late deliberately after the initial cocktail hour had passed, wearing an outfit that signaled absolute composure. Nothing flashy, nothing overtly defiant, just impeccably tailored charcoal wool that absorbed the light and made me look like a necessary fixture rather than a guest. Veronica was already holding court near the dessert station, her laughter pitched high and carrying across the room precisely the behavior I needed to see. She had the initial rundown of the Miami projections already in hand, accepting tentative congratulations from mid-level associates who assumed she had simply stepped up to manage an unfortunate personnel issue. She was basking in the glow of control. When she finally spotted me, her smile tightened, the practiced mask barely hiding a flicker of insecurity. She approached with the slow, predatory grace of a cat who has just secured its prey. "Carmen," she purred, leaning in as if sharing a secret, though every word was calibrated for an audience of 2 junior analysts nearby. "So good to see you back among the living. Richard was worried about the optics of you missing this. You look like you've had a restful week." The implication was clear. "You took a brief vacation while I secured your future." I met her gaze evenly, refusing to flinch at the casual cruelty. "The rest was productive, Veronica. I used the downtime to go over some older files, double-checking everything before I returned to active duty. You know how it is when you're managing the details, you sometimes miss the big picture." I let the ambiguity hang there, a tiny seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of her own paranoia. I mentioned the details and big picture because I knew the structure of her own lies was based on overlooking the finer print. "Of course," she dismissed quickly, eager to change the subject back to her ascendancy. "It's a complicated deal. I'm glad I could step in smoothly. You'll find the handover notes are quite thorough. Richard mentioned I might be briefing the executive committee on the initial success metrics tomorrow morning." This was the confession I had been waiting for, delivered with smug certainty. She was confirming she had claimed the prize and was already planning the victory speech. "The handover notes," I echoed, nodding slowly, pulling a slim brushed aluminum device, the remote for the main presentation system, from my inner jacket pocket. It was barely noticeable, no larger than a cigar case. "Yes, I'm sure they are thorough, but I do wonder if they covered everything." I paused, tapping the device lightly with my thumb. "For instance, Veronica, did they cover the specifics of the obsolete PDF software used to create the exhibits that led to my suspension? Or perhaps they didn't cover the fact that your friend Marcus recorded a rather illuminating conversation you had about how those exhibits were fabricated last week." The air around us immediately grew cold, the casual chatter of the nearby analysts ceasing abruptly. Veronica's carefully composed face fractured. Her eyes darted frantically not to Uncle Richard, but to the high-mounted projection screen currently displaying the firm's quarterly earnings graph. That screen, the centerpiece of the room, was now my only focus. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and absolute. The ambient noise of polite success vanished, replaced by a vacuum of stunned silence. Veronica's face, seconds before radiating smug triumph, was now a tight, white mask of pure panic. She knew instantly that I hadn't just guessed. I had confirmation. "You're bluffing," she hissed, a thin, ugly sound that she clearly hadn't intended for public consumption. She made a clumsy move to grab my wrist, an instinctual physical reaction that instantly looked desperate and uncontrolled in front of the associates. I smoothly deflected her hand, stepping back just far enough to create a professional distance. "Bluffing requires a lack of leverage, Veronica. You've just confirmed in front of witnesses that you know exactly what I'm referring to, the fabricated evidence, the timing, and the key player who recorded your celebration." I kept my voice low, a cold counterpoint to the sudden rising murmur of the room. I didn't need to yell. The sheer gravity of the accusation, delivered with surgical precision, did the work for me. At that moment, Uncle Richard, sensing the energy collapse, finally broke through the small crowd forming around us. His expression was an unreadable mix of alarm and suppressed fury. He saw the spectral presence of the large, high-definition screen looming above us, the one I had insisted on setting up, currently displaying nothing but a blank, inviting white canvas. "Carmen, Veronica, what is the meaning of this scene?" Richard's voice was a low command laced with decades of unquestioned authority. This was the precise moment I had planned for the need for orderly resolution. I didn't look at Richard. I looked only at Veronica, forcing her to witness the delivery of her own sentence. "Uncle Richard, I was about to demonstrate how during my suspension, Veronica was not only celebrating taking my file, but was detailing the exact fabrication used to frame me. I have the evidence of her intent, and I have the technical proof that the documentation presented to the partners carried an obsolete digital signature proving external fabrication." I turned slightly, addressing the room generally, my demeanor utterly devoid of heat. "I do not wish to litigate this here, but I need one definitive action. I need a level playing field to present the truth, or the injunction proceeds tomorrow." I held up the small remote. "If you want the full context of the evidence that got me suspended and the proof of who manufactured it, it only takes one button press." I advanced 3 steps toward the main podium where the AV controls were located, never taking my eyes off Veronica. She looked trapped, realizing that any attempt to stop me would be an admission of guilt to the growing audience of partners who were now watching with alarming focus. Her ambition had made her predictable, and predictability is the first thing a strategist exploits. The tension wasn't just rising, it was solidifying into a heavy, visible structure of impending collapse. I took the single step required to reach the podium, my movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. I held the remote, its matte black surface, cool against my palm, and looked directly at Uncle Richard, bypassing Veronica entirely for the moment. This was not a negotiation. It was a presentation of a forensic finding. "Uncle Richard," I said, my voice projecting just enough to carry over the tension, but remaining level. "I have already secured the legal mandate to proceed with an injunction if this is not handled internally and transparently tonight. However, I believe the firm would prefer to see this evidence demonstrated now rather than printed in tomorrow's financial papers." I didn't wait for permission. I pressed the primary button on the remote. The earnings graph vanished from the massive screen above, replaced instantly by a stark black background. Then the first image flooded the room, a high-resolution screenshot of the metadata log from the alleged misappropriated files. The audience, composed of the firm's most powerful decision-makers, leaned in as one. I had highlighted in glaring red text the specific anomaly, software creation identifier Apex PDF Pro V4. One obsolete. A few sharp intakes of breath rippled through the partners. That software hadn't been standard issue for 3 years. It was a subtle digital fingerprint, but under the scrutiny of this sudden public spotlight, it screamed manipulation. Before anyone could process the technical detail, I cycled to the next slide. This one contained only text, a perfect transcription of Veronica's voice from the recording Marcus had provided, overlaid on a static image of her company headshot. The relevant section glowed. I just need David to think Carmen's been greedy, not that she's careless. A little data injection into the old Apex files and we're clear. She never checks the source signature. The silence that followed the reading of that transcribed sentence was so profound, it felt like physical pressure. Veronica finally broke. Her composure shattered completely, replaced by a raw, desperate scramble for control. She lunged forward, shouting something inaudible about slander and fabrication, reaching desperately for the podium, as if she could physically stop the image from existing on the screen. This was the climax, the complete inversion of power. I was no longer the accused. I was the prosecutor presenting the undeniable findings. I stepped aside just as Uncle Richard, finally seeing the catastrophic nature of the situation, moved to physically restrain his niece. Security. Richard barked, his voice unrecognizable, the patriarch losing control in his own ballroom. I hit the final button. The screen transitioned one last time. It showed not more evidence, but a single clean legal document, a formal notice of my immediate and unconditional reinstatement to the firm signed by all named partners, present acknowledging the initial suspension was based on fraudulent claims. Beneath that, in smaller font, was the directive for an immediate independent review of Veronica's handling of the Catalyst acquisition handover. The message was delivered. I had not only proven my innocence, but I had weaponized the truth to dismantle her position entirely, all without raising my voice above a measured conversational tone. The game had been flipped, and Veronica was staring directly at the consequence of her arrogance projected 10 feet high. The final image on the screen, the formal notice of my unconditional reinstatement, froze the chaos in the room more effectively than Richard's security detail. Veronica, still struggling, was now being firmly escorted away, her protests dissolving into desperate, choked-off sobs. She wasn't railing against me. She was railing against the loss of her future, a loss she had meticulously engineered for herself. The partners, moments before engaged in social pleasantries, now stood arrayed like a silent jury, their faces etched with the calculated coldness that comes from realizing a financial asset Veronica had become a sudden, massive liability. I stood at the podium, allowing the silence and the bright light of the screen to do the heavy lifting. I did not speak again immediately. I simply lowered the remote, placing it carefully on the polished wood, signaling that my presentation was complete. I had delivered the evidence, secured my position, and forced the internal exposure of the fraud, all in the span of 90 seconds. The power shift was absolute, made tangible by the fact that I was the one standing calmly at the center of the firm's most public crisis, and she was the one being removed. Uncle Richard approached the podium, his face a roadmap of conflicting emotions, anger at the betrayal, fear of the public fallout, and perhaps a grudging respect for the clinical efficacy of my countermove. He didn't look at me, but addressed the room in a voice that was now tight with professional damage control. Ladies and gentlemen, this unfortunate misunderstanding will be handled internally and swiftly. The firm will, of course, be issuing a statement confirming Carmen's full exoneration and return to active duty effective immediately. He carefully avoided using the word fraud, opting instead for the corporate euphemism misunderstanding. But the partners understood precisely what he meant. I finally spoke, my voice cutting through the forced formality of Richard's attempt at minimization. Richard. While I appreciate the statement, I said, using his first name to subtly assert a new level of parody, the evidence clearly indicates a systematic attempt at corporate espionage and defamation, orchestrated by a named associate. I expect not merely an internal review, but a forensic audit of all communications related to the Catalyst acquisition for the last 12 months. This is not about saving face. It is about securing the firm against future identical attacks. This insistence on the audit was my final lock on the situation. It ensured that even if Veronica tried to minimize her actions later, the subsequent findings would create a legal trail that she could not escape. It was the difference between a slap on the wrist and a career-ending report. Richard met my gaze, a battle of wills passing between us. He understood that my claim was entirely valid and that my leverage, the threat of the immediate injunction, and the public disclosure of the recorded evidence was still very much active. He finally gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "It will be done, Carmen. Every communication will be audited." I offered a small, cool smile. Order had been restored, but not on the firm's terms of containment, but on my terms of absolute transparency and consequence. I retrieved the remote, pocketing it as I stepped away from the podium, leaving Richard to deal with the inevitable hushed questions from the stunned partners. My work for the evening was complete. I had delivered the evidence, reclaimed my career, and ensured that my cousin's arrogance had become the instrument of her total defeat. The aftermath of the projection was not a frenzy, but a controlled disintegration of Veronica's professional life. I did not linger at the podium to accept congratulations or witness her complete removal. Instead, I retrieved my coat and moved toward the exit, observing the cascading effects of the revelation from a professional distance. The partners didn't cluster to discuss the Miami deal's projections. They clustered around Richard, their voices low, urgent, and focused entirely on risk mitigation. Veronica had ceased to be a cousin or a colleague. She was a breach in security protocol, a potential liability, whose fraud could taint the entire Catalyst acquisition. Her reputation, painstakingly constructed on years of false charm and aggressive networking, evaporated instantly. She was already becoming the cautionary tale, the person whose greed had outweighed her intelligence. The formal follow-up began before the gala was even officially over. I received a private text from Mr. Chen, my attorney auditors already dispatched. Forensic team is on site. The legal threat I had leveraged was now manifesting as a ruthless internal cleanup operation. Richard was not protecting Veronica. He was protecting the firm, and the fastest way to achieve that was to cut the infection out entirely. I arrived at my apartment to find a voicemail from Veronica's mother, my Aunt Carol, who had always viewed me as an inconvenient second-place trophy. The message was a rambling emotional mess, not an apology, but a desperate plea for me to show some family loyalty and minimize the incident for Richard's sake. She framed it as a misunderstanding under pressure, attempting to paint Veronica as an ambitious victim. I deleted the message without saving it. Family loyalty in this context was a unilateral expectation that I would absorb injustice to protect their comfortable narrative. That negotiation was over. The next morning, the official notice hit the internal servers. It was brief and cold. Consultant Veronica Vance is no longer with the firm, effective immediately. Miss Carmen, my surname, is reinstated and will resume leadership of the Catalyst acquisition. There was no mention of the misunderstanding. It was a clean, surgical severing. The narrative was simple and undeniable. She was out, I was in, and the underlying reason was corporate misconduct. The orderly revenge was already spreading its quiet consequences. The forensic audit, as expected, was a methodical dismantling of Veronica's short-lived triumph. When I returned to the office the next day, I didn't find shame or discomfort among my colleagues, but a palpable sense of renewed professional respect. My actions had been cold, but they had also been lawful and definitive, which in that environment was the highest form of competency. The firm prioritized stability, and I had demonstrated unequivocally that I was the stable force. The auditors confirmed not only the fabricated email metadata, but also traced the login history for the obsolete software back to a rarely used remote server access point one Veronica had maintained from her initial junior tenure. The paper trail they uncovered was damning, revealing multiple instances where she had shadowed my communications not to assist, but to identify vulnerabilities. She hadn't just tried to steal the deal. She had been preparing the ambush for nearly a year. This level of premeditation turned her corporate sabotage into a matter of high-level malfeasance, far beyond a simple breach of policy. Uncle Richard called me into his private office late that afternoon. The usual affable warmth was gone, replaced by a weary, profound disappointment that transcended business. She lost everything, Carmen. The partnership track is gone. The commission on the deal is forfeited. And the investigation is now looking at potential charges for wire fraud related to the document fabrication. He leaned back, running a hand over his face. She was banking on the fact that I would never sacrifice a relative for a consultant. She underestimated your preparation. She underestimated the firm's need for stability. Richard, I corrected him gently, and she mistook my composure for weakness. When people assume you're emotional, they miss the logic you're deploying. I didn't gloat. I offered him a diagnosis. The real lasting consequence, the one that fulfilled the revenge narrative, perfectly arrived 2 days later. Veronica was not only fired, but was formally banned from applying to any firm doing business with our family's consortium for 5 years, effectively making her a pariah in our specialized sector of the industry. Her attempts to secure a broker license for her personal endeavors were immediately put under review, stalled by the very allegations she had fabricated against me. She had gambled her entire career on a quick, cruel win, and the consequences were now closing in, absolute and legal. She was stripped not just of her wealth, but of her professional identity and future earning power. It was the orderly, absolute defeat I had sought. The quiet satisfaction of seeing my strategy executed perfectly was not a rush of elation, but a deep, pervasive calm. I had navigated the storm not with rage or tears, but with logic and leverage. The firm's damage control was efficient. A single brief email to the entire staff confirmed Veronica's immediate departure and my resumption of the Catalyst acquisition. The family, however, was another matter. I knew the formal public consequences for Veronica. The firing, the audit, the industry blacklisting were only half the revenge. The final essential piece was the reestablishment of my own narrative within the family structure. The toxicity that had allowed Veronica to operate stemmed from a deep-seated belief among the older relatives that I was competent but emotionally volatile, easily provoked, and therefore easily dismissed. Her arrogance had banked on this perception. 2 weeks after the gala, Uncle Richard hosted a mandatory small family dinner, a desperate attempt to put a professional face on the personal disaster. I arrived composed, professional, and slightly late. The tension was thick, weighted by the empty seat where Veronica should have been, and the visible distress of Aunt Carol. Aunt Carol cornered me as soon as I set down my wine glass. Her voice was a low, desperate hiss. "Carmen, what you did was professional suicide. You ruined her. She has nothing left. Your family. You have to tell Richard it was a mistake that she only got carried away. You can't let them ruin her license over an email." I met her eyes, which were brimming with a mixture of fear and calculated guilt-tripping. "Aunt Carol," I said, my voice barely audible above the light clink of silverware. "What I did was protect the integrity of a multi-million-dollar acquisition that is critical to Richard's firm, and by extension critical to the family's financial stability. The firm's auditors confirmed it was not a mistake. It was premeditated corporate fraud. Her ruin was self-inflicted." She tried to play her final familial card. "But forgiveness, Carmen. She's your cousin. We are supposed to uplift each other, not tear down our own blood." I smiled, a thin, cool expression that reached neither my eyes nor my heart. "I agree completely, Aunt Carol. We are supposed to uplift each other." Veronica's decision to fabricate evidence and risk the entire Catalyst acquisition in an attempt to displace me demonstrated she had no interest in uplifting anyone but herself. Forgiveness is a transaction, and I see no value offered in return for letting a crime go unpunished. Order is restored now. That is all that matters. I turned my back on her and walked over to discuss the future of the Miami portfolio with Uncle Richard, leaving her standing alone with her empty appeal. The power shift was now complete on the personal as well as the professional front. I had enforced my peace.